All right, well, let's get started. So welcome everybody to the next episode in our Upheaval Management webinar series. Today, we are talking about how to leverage your IP portfolio for the long game. So what I'm going to do is introduce our two panelists that we have today, and then we will get started. So Jeff Holman is on with us, and he has a broad background that spans law, engineering, and business. Innovating with confidence is his kind of tagline that he uses, or the guiding philosophy and vision he adopted for his professional career and relationships. So that's a little bit about Jeff. And then Jason Tazinkiewicz, who is with Blue Sky Business Resources, has been helping business owners optimize their business and transition out of it for the last 20 plus years. And he also has a pretty colorful background from an engineering degree to a culinary trained chef and alphabet soup in the M&A industry as well. So before I turn it over to our presenters, I want to let you know that throughout this webinar, you are going to hear some content about our upcoming event, the Elevate Summit for Entrepreneurs. A fully interactive virtual event is happening November 19th. So we're announcing that date today. So very excited for that. And at the end of the webinar, I'm going to give you a link that you can join our wait list for the ticket launch and our early bird special to be one of the first ones signed up for that conference. So again, it'll be before our Q&A session. So if you do have questions at any time during the webinar, feel free to pop those into the Q&A. I will monitor that and interject questions, but we will have a Q&A session at the end as well. So with that, Jeff, I hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. And it's great to be here with you and Jason. I do need to know now, though, Jason, what's your engineering background?
Chemical.
Oh, very nice. You were very smart then.
So I wouldn't go that far.
I don't think I could have hacked that one. Mine is in electrical engineering. So, but very glad to be here today with everybody. I'm going to share my screen. We electrical engineers can handle at least that usually. So hopefully you see my screen there and I don't mess it up during the presentation. But we're going to talk today about IP strategy. We're going to talk, I'm going to give the IP side, some of the strategy side. Jason's going to pitch in on the financial discussion, and I'm sure strategy and other things he's seen in the business M&A side of the transactions he's doing. And then we're, as Amy said, we're happy to take questions. So I've got a lot of materials here. And so I'm going to try to go through them. First, I'll talk about it in a second. So before we get to what the agenda is, yeah.
1 second, Jeff. I don't see your screen yet. I don't think it's shared.
Oh, you don't?
You got a little too confident in your electrical engineering.
Man.
I think.
There you go. Now you're good.
Is that better? It's like the other night. I'm not a culinary trained chef, but I think I make some pretty good grilled chicken. And I told my daughter and her friends who were out in our backyard swimming, look at this. This is how chicken's done. And as soon as I did that, I took it in the house, cut it open, and it wasn't cooked all the way. It looked great, but it wasn't cooked all the way. I did not clarify that for my daughter's friends. Anyway, is the screen there now?
It's beautiful.
Wonderful. So maybe some engineers can handle sharing. So I'd love to ask, when is the time that you've been most strategic? And this is just for the chat. Just feel free to put that in there. I have to find my chat again here, I think, so I could see it. But talk about when you've been most strategic, and if there's something that stands out, I'm happy to use that. But use the chat all you want to put questions in. We will go through that. So I'm not going to go through our backgrounds. I do like to mix it up, though. Sometimes you see me with longer hair, sometimes a beard, sometimes not. Jason seems to always look good. I think the tie is one of those secrets. But today we're going to talk about business strategy a little bit. We're going to talk about IP strategy, go through some case studies showing how this can apply and how you can tell your IP story in your business. If that all fails for any reason, I'm going to default and tell you about either, you know, my camping hatchet accident, maybe the mudslide that took down that house next to the tennis court I was playing on. Or I can tell you about the time I was chased by a bear in Alaska. I don't recommend it. Or the time my daughters and I were scuba diving when, if you remember, the fake, fortunately, missile threat that happened in Hawaii. I was there that day. That was awesome. So I can talk about any of that stuff if the rest of the presentation goes south. So hopefully nothing like that will happen though during the presentation. So let's see, make sure I'm going the right way. So what is strategy? So before I give you my definition, which it took me a long time, maybe I'm slower because I'm an electrical engineer, not a chemical engineer. Maybe I'm slower to figure out what is strategy, but I had to read a lot of books. I think I had to go get my MBA just to figure out how to think about what is strategy. But I love this picture. This is, it was in 1957, if I remember right. Walt Disney put together this sketch that outlines what his thought process was for what Disney would look like. And if you take, I think it's 2019, this view of what Disney has become, it is incredible. What's amazing to me though is you see some similarities between the two. You have to look closely because there's so much going on, but some of the boxes in the left there actually correspond really closely to boxes on the right. Things
Jeff,
that they, yeah.
we're not seeing that slide.
You are not.
No, we're still seeing your emergency alert slide.
Okay, so am I not sharing? Let me stop sharing for a second because it says I'm sharing, but apparently when I switch over, it doesn't. Let me do this. I'm going to share a window instead of my screen. That might work better. Gosh. Good thing this is not a presentation on giving a presentation. Do you see the screen, the same slide now?
It's loading, but I'll let you know.
So we are slow, huh? On our share.
Amy, are you seeing it? Is it just me?
Oh gosh.
That still just says that you started sharing, but it's just a black screen still.
Let's see. Maybe it doesn't like the size of the images. What to do here? It's a really cool picture. So when you do see it, you'll love it. I might have to send these out or something so people can see it. I can talk, but it's not nearly as interesting if you can't see the, well, I think it's interesting, but it's not nearly as visual if you can't see the screen. So nothing on the screen, huh?
So it was just black saying you started.
So you saw you were able to see the other though, right? The screen before.
Yep. But then when you clicked the slide, it didn't change. It was just stayed on that same.
Okay. I'm gonna pull up my PowerPoint. Maybe I can share that screen. We will do what we can. Let's see, PowerPoint.
Send the slides out after though, if we can't get them to show and just keep talking.
Sure. Share that. Does that share?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yep.
Well, let's see if we can make it past, slide 4. Are we back to the plan slide?
Correct. Yes.
What is strategy?
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's it for today. That's all I've got. I got to stop on a high note here, I think. Not really. So this is the slide with Disney.
Yeah.
So 1957 is on the left there, and 2019 or so is on the right. And when you, the idea behind this is when you think of strategy, you know, I hear a lot of people say, well, strategy is goals, strategy is a plan, strategy is choice. You know, for me, those are all sort of true. Strategy really is a framework. It's a choice framework. It's the framework that you decide to use to make choices in your business and develop a plan or set goals. What is the framework that you're setting up to make those choices, to set those goals? And that's going to drive, of course, how you function, how you operate, the types of choices you make. You know, some people might say that, you know, a positive attitude is a strategy because it gives you a framework that influences how you make choices in your personal life, just as an example. So I love this slide because it kind of illustrates Disney's foresight in creating a plan that influenced and was fulfilled over many, many years. A great dream that a lot of us enjoy quite a lot. So here's how I define strategy. Strategy is a plan, of course. It's to leverage your valuable resources for a sustainable advantage. It's got to be aligned with your business objectives in a competitive environment. We'll talk just briefly on each of these because this isn't really the core of the presentation. But I think I have to set this foundation because I've talked to a lot of companies about IP strategy, and almost invariably we go in and say, let's talk about IP strategy and we're going to align it with your business strategy. Tell me about your business strategy. And they're like, well, you know, our mission statement is to be the number one in our industry because we have the best customer service. And so that's how we operate, which is totally fine, but not really a strategy. So to break this down, we would say, well, what is your business going to achieve in the next, 2 to 10 years or some relevant time frame? What types of strengths do you have? What types of capabilities, resources, employees do you have to be able to deploy in a valuable way? What's your long-term differentiator? What type of leader will you be? And in a competitive advantage vocabulary, that really means, if you break it down most simply, a lot of people say, well, that's either cost leadership or that's product differentiation. And there are different, sub levels of competitive advantage leadership that you could have there. And then of course you're doing all of this within some type of competitive market, some type of industry where you're competing. So we'll go through each of these just real quickly. We're going to skip that slide, and I'll skip a lot of these slides because I want to make sure I end on time for you guys and leave time for questions. We're going to skip that slide, but really, when I go through this, if you ever have to walk through this with somebody, it's good to have the definition of strategy. I have those 5 things. That's what I use. You might use the same thing. And then I start at the bottom. I say, well, let's look at your competitive advantage, your competitive landscape first. Where are you competing? And there are some tools you can use to evaluate that. And maybe you want to evaluate getting into a new market versus the market you're already in. There are tools, established tools to do that. And then you say, well, what is our business objective? And I mentioned cost leadership and product differentiation. There's also something that sits sort of in the middle there, value innovation. It's more aligned with blue ocean, going into a new market that doesn't have, real direct competitors at the moment. That doesn't last very long. You'll end up in one of the other 2 categories generally over time. But so you say, what is our business objective? Because if you want to be a cost leader, meaning lowest cost products, highest volume probably, that's going to drive how you do, decisions in logistics and suppliers and your customer service and everything. So all of this impacts the choices you make and the way you run your business. And you'll see why that's important relative to IP in just a minute. Sustainable advantage, we're not going to go into that. That's an endless black hole, sort of. I will mention, though, that I love Jay Barney. He's actually moved here to Utah and teaches at the University of Utah near where I'm at. And one of his early articles from about 1991 acknowledges that one of the reasons that you might have a sustainable advantage is, the professor term causal ambiguity, which just means you don't know why you have a sustainable advantage. And as long as you don't know, you can keep that up, because as soon as you figure out why you have an advantage, that means, you know, you're no smarter necessarily than the rest of the industry. So the rest of the industry is also going to be able to figure out why you have a sustainable advantage and then replicate it. So that's just the irony of, you know, the unknown reason for sustainable advantage. Valuable resources. I do like this slide relative to IP, because IP is considered an asset, right? You put it in on your balance sheet, perhaps you create it, you're allocating expenses to it, you're putting personnel on it to develop it, you're purchasing it from somebody else. These are typical criteria you look at when you say, what is a valuable resource that we can or might deploy on behalf of our organization? And with IP, you might do that, you know, very aggressively against your competitors. You might have more of a defensive position. But when you look at it, you say, okay, is it valuable? Meaning, is there an opportunity to create money or save money? Is it rare? Well, IP by definition, if you have granted patents, for example, or a registered trademark, is rare. Inimitability, is it easy to be imitated by somebody else? Well, again, patents, trademarks, IP, that might be difficult to imitate. And then do you have operational exploitation? And I kind of fit that in there to get the O up front. But can your organization actually use that IP somehow? Do you have the capability to deploy it? You know, there might be all types of, you know, fantastic state-of-the-art AI and machine learning out there, but I probably am not the guy to go and, you know, write the software to implement it. I don't have that capability. I'm not a chemical engineer. I wouldn't know how to do the chemistry and the engineering behind certain things. So what's interesting though is most of the time when I talk to clients, we get to this type of discussion and they just say, well, we have IP. It's rare. Nobody can imitate it by law. And they might not have the ability to even, you know, come up with it because our guys are the best in the world at this thing. And that's all well and good, but that doesn't translate necessarily into value, right? You need to have the value component and the ability to exploit the value of it. And without that, just the rarity alone, I don't know, we've all, as kids, probably found rocks and collected them because they were cool. And maybe some of them were really rare. But I know I've seen boxes of rocks sitting around my house from my kids that even if they're rare, they're just sitting around my house. I wouldn't know what to do with them. They don't either. So they're probably not very valuable other than for me to kick that box once in a while in the dark. So I hope this is helpful. We're going to skip this so we can get into IP strategy discussions a little bit more. But this is just a version. If you've seen the business or the business model canvas, this is my version of it because it's I think it's more visually aligned with the actual operations of the business. And if you take a real quick peek, this is my strategy, how I put stuff together. It's at least one of the ways I look at my strategy, my actual strategy, where I'm going. I'm not doing all of this. It's, you know, you implement it over time, but it gives me vision and a framework as I make decisions with hiring or taking on clients or you know, investing in marketing or whatever it might be. I use that to make my decisions. That's my framework. So we're going to skip that. That's if you really want to apply it to your personal life. So here's an example of a plan. This is, and we'll come back to this at the very end if we have a minute. It's not super interesting, but somebody came to me and said, well, how do I, you know, we actually are investing in money, and how do I take this money and create IP? What would be a plan to deploy a certain amount of money over a certain amount of time to get the best bang for my buck? Which, you know, as a general question is difficult to answer because it depends on, you know, a lot more circumstances of the company, but you might create your own plan. You guys all have financial plans that you guys are implementing. We're going to skip that despite the great graphics. And we're going to get into IP strategy now. So if there are any questions, let me pause here because I tend to just talk. I really like this topic and I tend to just talk. If there are any questions, Amy, let me know. Jason, if you have some additions here to make, like feel free, please, to interject. I'm happy to take a breath. In fact, I'm going to get a drink. I'm going to force myself to stop.
All right. One thing that I'd like to just jump in with, because you sparked some great ideas in my mind, is that, you know, when I talk to business owners, they all have very rigorous plans for their fixed asset strategy. They do vetting of the asset. They get competitive bids. They map out their ROI. They talk about post break even gains, and they plan for obsolescence, and they track that obsolescence through a depreciation schedule on their balance sheet. However, most business owners I work with don't have any intellectual property tracked on their balance sheet. When I ask what their plan is, you know, half of them don't even recognize what intellectual property they own, and a lot of their R&D work, you know, if they're not acquiring, you know, accidentally having intellectual property on their balance sheet because they acquired a company, they may have some kind of R&D, and that R&D is largely centered around, well, we can do this and it's cool, versus we did the same type of work to determine what kind of time and resource allocation we are willing to put into it, and what our returns are, the way they would with asset plans. So I love where you're going with the strategic plan, and I just wanted to kind of throw those you know, juxtapositions out there, you know, to further feed what you're saying, and to help keep everybody in mind of, you know, it's really easy to look at a physical asset as something you want to squeeze value out of through a strategic plan. We should be putting the same effort and diligence into recognizing our intellectual property, and then placing it on the balance sheet and forming a plan to squeeze, you know, returns out of it before it becomes obsolete, and not, you know, not neglecting the fact that intellectual property also becomes obsolete.
Yes. Thank you so much. That's a fantastic point. And I will confess, I'm going to do a presentation cheat a little bit, because I'm not going to give an answer as to how to value IP today. That's if you ask me, that's a black art, and probably should be treated as such. I know people want it. Investors, board members, management might demand that we value our IP. We're not going to do valuations. There are no valuation secrets today. What we do, with the approach I suggest, is that you look at what because people that have plans, they know what their business strategy is, at least to some degree, even if they don't articulate it in a granular way. What the best thing you can do before you get to valuation questions is say, is our IP aligned with our business strategy? And if you can at least qualitatively articulate that alignment, you're most of the way there, because you can do all of the pruning that you need to do. This stuff's not aligned, or it's less aligned. This stuff's more aligned. And there might be a variety of reasons why something's aligned or why it's not. So that's the framework we're going to talk about for IP strategy and alignment. But thank you for the additional comments, Jason. Amy, did
Yeah,
we have any?
absolutely. And
Oh,
one other
sorry.
thing I'd just like to throw into there, I do agree with you that there's a lot of subjectivity to the IP valuations I'm seeing on the market. But a good rule of thumb is you don't value a fixed asset on your balance sheet for more than you paid for it. So, you know, I would say, as a balance sheet mechanism, always use your invested cost, and you can worry about the return on that investment from a valuation standpoint if you're looking to liquidate the business, and selling that IP as part of the going concern.
Yeah. And that makes sense. I think that, correct me if I'm wrong in my statement here, but I think that is probably most accurate, or viewed most accurately, when you're acquiring IP as part of an acquisition, because you're getting kind of a real-time assessment of that value, as opposed to, you know, what was the cost to obtain it, which is, you know, probably much less than you would value it at if you're going to buy it after the fact. So
Absolutely, and the same is true for fixed assets, right? If you built a good organization that is capitalizing and maximizing the going concern benefit of your fixed assets, you're going to sell the business for significantly more than you would ever get for the assets. And so, if you just think about intellectual property as an asset from a balance sheet perspective, you're in good shape.
Very good. I think and I think that's why when we talk about qualitatively looking at alignment, I think the best thing you can do is find what your story is around your IP. Our story is that we can articulate the reasons that this is aligned with our business, or maybe maybe you're selling your business, and this is why when someone buys it, they should value the IP the same way. Maybe if you're the one purchasing a business, you can look at their IP and say, you know what, we really want to buy that because it actually aligns better with us than it does with them. And we can get some arbitrage from that purchase. Or maybe you want to devalue that IP and say, yeah, I see how in your strategy, there's maybe is some very good alignment, but when we buy you, you fit into a different strategy, and we can now articulate why your IP to us isn't worth, it's worth 50% of what it would be to you. So anyway, creating that story, that discussion around IP is critical, I believe. So
Yeah.
Amy, oh, go ahead, Jason.
I could give two examples if we have time. If not, we can move on. I think we've
yeah, no, well. Certainly. I can talk as fast as I need to the rest of the time.
Perfect. One example of a business owner misjudging their intellectual property. Jeff, you had talked about patents and about the idea that by law, they have staved off competition. And patents are, they're a double-edged sword, because you get the protection, but you also make public your secret sauce, and in some cases, that protection is only as good as your willingness to fight for it. I had one client with a patent that was near the end of its life cycle, and he was trying to negotiate very hard for additional value on the business based on this patent. And at the end of the day, the acquirer said, you know what, you can keep your patent. I'm just going to buy the business for the price I think the business is worth, because that intellectual property isn't worth very much to me. And on the other side, I'm working with a business right now where they're able to gain a business value through the employment of their intellectual property of about $5 million in round figures. However, we found 3 different strategic targets that this intellectual property is the missing link to their long-term strategic plan. So they're right now fighting for the business in the $30 million range, specifically because of what that intellectual property means to them. So, it can go in both directions, but I always try to tell people to temper your expectations. Don't get too fixated on your intellectual property being more valuable than your ability to put it to work. And the worst is going to happen if you're wrong is that you'll be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's fantastic. Thanks for sharing those. Yeah. If you don't have that operational exploitation capability, the value really isn't there. So, and you end up speculating on a bunch of assets that sound like magic words or something. And maybe, your investors or your original investors were really impressed, but your buyer might not be. So, before I ask Amy, do you have any questions that have come up that we need to address?
Nothing yet, but remember, if you do have any, put them in the chat box or the Q&A.
Wonderful. I have never given a presentation where I was so clear in everything I said. So anyway, no, we welcome questions. So so this slide here just shows that over time the value, and I think this is probably known. This has been a little bit of documented study here, though. over time, since what is this, 1975 through 2018, the valuation of IP as a percentage of overall enterprise value has skyrocketed from below 20% to over 80% when you look at, and these are larger companies, right? So they probably more so focus on IP. When you get to smaller companies, you have sort of divisions between people who are building brands and people who are, creating technology, and some who are, just operating businesses. But if we are targeting to become a larger big business over time, this is the type of mix that you can expect to see at that level of industry. So anyway, it's pretty amazing how much of a business is now intellectual property or intangible assets. And there is a distinction there, right? Just to be clear. So there are some intangible assets are outside of IP, and others are including IP. So
yeah, so you'd be talking about goodwill, personal and organizational goodwill, and things of that nature as the other intangibles, correct?
Yeah. Yep. Thank you. All right. So when I look at a company, I referenced this a little bit before. When I look at a company and I say, okay, I actually did this when I first went in-house, because I was a patent attorney for a while, and someone would send me a disclosure of an invention and say, get us a patent. And I was like, oh, okay, I'd get you a patent. But I always struggled, at least I struggled really initially. I was like, well, what do they really want? They just want a patent. I'm like, what about their business? They just want a patent. That was the law firm training, part of the law firm training. They just want a patent. So when I went in-house many years later, I started thinking, well, where does IP really fit into the overall picture? And if you put this together, and there are probably other ways to do this, but if you look at the overall aspects of a business, IP sits in one kind of small category of assets there. But when you look at where the impact of IP is in the business, I mean, IP can influence almost every aspect of the business. And so this means a couple of things. One, its importance is probably greater than, what you first see. Two, you can probably, develop your story around a lot of different areas of your company if it's helpful in valuing your company, entering into a transaction, whatever it might be. So it had a big impression on me when I was just started coloring everything. I mean, literally just turn that green, wait a second. Everything is like IP comes into play. And I did that based on the experience I was having actually working in house. Yeah, I've done that. Yeah, we had to do that. Okay, that happens. So,
Jeff, I have questions for you.
Oh, we have questions.
Yes. So
awesome.
This one I think refers a little bit more to the previous slide. Do you think IP is what's driving the stock values for Apple, as an example, to such high values when their overall revenue isn't meaningfully increased?
Jason might answer that better. My thoughts very briefly would be they do have IP. They have, like Apple. These large companies have very big brands, and there's a lot of value attributed to the brands. They also have a lot of cash sitting out there. And so I think cash is a big contributor. But Jason, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, sticking with Apple, there are a myriad different things to consider. First and foremost, over the last 5 years, Apple has been aggressively turning a portion of that cash into stock buybacks, and by having less stock out in the market, they can artificially increase their own value. So that always needs to be looked at when you're looking at businesses where the stock price is increasing faster than the revenue and profitability, is what's the nature of buybacks in that valuation. The next thing that I would say is, if you look at Apple compared to Samsung, for the last several years, Samsung has lagged a little bit behind in innovation, and they've played a little bit more fast and loose with the what I call IP trolling and buying patents so that they can sue, and that puts a negative impression on the market. And Apple has actually come out way ahead of Samsung in that battle, not because they've necessarily persevered in the courtrooms more, but because they're seen as more innovative, because they're not playing patent troll and bringing the legal system into their business as much. They're still doing it, but not to the same degree. That they get to be seen as the technological innovators. So as long as the tech space is still perceived as young, as growing, as open to significant disruption in consumer goods through innovation, Apple is remaining stronger than their cash flow would typically indicate. And that's why you see Apple and Alphabet up at the top in 2018, and you don't see Samsung up there because they're not perceived as much as an innovator, and they're also not so aggressively buying back stock.
Yeah. I would also add that I think that, and again, this might be more of a financial artifact, but a lot of companies, when you're smaller and you're building your own IP, it doesn't, as Jason mentioned before, it doesn't hit your financials the same way as when you purchase. So when you've over time done lots of acquisitions, I think that's going to have a kind of disproportionate effect on the percentages that you allocate to your intangible asset pool.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have one other.
And go ahead. The only thing that I wanted to say, and this is just building on Jeff's point, the balance sheets get heavier in intangibles the more acquisitions there are. So, you know, one of the takeaways that I would like for every business owner and every business owner advisor that's on this call is determine, if you don't have any intellectual intellectual property or intangible assets on your balance sheet, you're not managing and planning to receive value. So identify those things and get them on your balance sheet strictly so that you have that monthly or period-wide reminder of another asset that you need to be extracting value from. But I wouldn't get so hung up on the valuation of that.
Yeah. Okay, so our other question is, NASA is offering IP for sale or licensing at different rates according to buyer size. What pros and cons come with government IP?
So, you know, if you look, that's a great question. If you look at this list, I've actually updated this from the last time I presented, but didn't update this deck exactly. Government contracts, government funding, grants for IP. There are two ways to do it. One is the way that was suggested there, which is teaming up with or buying IP from government organizations, universities, and such. Maybe licensing IP from them. That's more of a typical transaction from what I've seen. You're purchasing the right, you're entering into a license agreement, much like you would with perhaps another entity, although there are certain restrictions on the types of terms you can get when you enter into an agreement with, for example, a state-owned university. They have mandates that they have to comply with, and they just don't have any negotiating room on some of those terms. On the other end of the spectrum, though, is government contract, government grants that you might apply for through NSA or DOD or whoever it might be. And that's actually, they're really good programs. I've got several clients who've made a business more or less out of becoming R&D companies by getting government grant funding or other grant funding. There are ownership pitfalls potentially with that. A lot of it, though, comes because there are requirements, reporting requirements and otherwise, that you have to comply with. A lot of that, what the impact ultimately might be, is that you might have a cloud on the title of the IP, perhaps, because you didn't report certain things that you had to report under the grant contract. And then when you don't do that and you get into a due diligence situation, you have to, you would have an obligation to report to whoever's asking, the potential acquirer, that your IP, your patents developed under those government grants potentially have issues around the title, that the U.S. government might have a claim to the title of those inventions. Now, there are ways to clean that up, but it's much better to do that in advance. So there are issues with it. It's a very good program if you're proactive about managing that, if you have somebody in-house who's familiar with the process. or you have an attorney who's done a lot of that, then you can manage that quite easily. And you can make very good use of the IP available through those programs. Those are my thoughts.
Jeff, one thing that I'd like to just caveat on that is my personal experience with the government grant programs is that they're heavily skewed towards proven entities and proven sectors of technology. I feel like, you know, I licensed out my IP almost a decade ago now, and I feel like the grant process has started getting softer for startups and for smaller businesses, but they're really risk averse. Is that still the case?
I would say that they do skew towards proven organizations requesting funding. They want somebody who can actually deliver. You know, they have to show the results of their program internally, and they want to make sure that the people they're giving money to are going to deliver. I think that not necessarily a lot of the government grant funding that or the companies that get government grant funding that we deal with are very innovative. They're actually developing not necessarily working on proven technologies so much as developing things that are probably 20 years out. The problem they have is they're so far out, there's not really a path to commercialization anytime soon. They're way ahead of the commercialization curve. And so there are ways though, like if you, and I should say we have my firm has done some webinars on this. We've done a series just strictly on government grant funding. I'm not the expert in our firm. Another attorney has done a lot of it, was in-house for 10 years with a company that you know, what that was their business model. He could speak to that better than I can. But the bottom line is, if you can get a good relationship, you know, I think that's where the real work comes in, is building that relationship with the organizational sponsor of the grant funding. Then you can figure out how to do it, and you can kind of get in and, you know, build trust and become one of those trusted organizations that has an easier time getting funding, and maybe even perhaps has the ability to help direct the types of FOAs or the requests that get put out for specific types of research to be done. So
Perfect.
All right, let's see. We've got about 17 minutes. I'm going to breeze through some things, but your questions are more important than the pictures that I've created. So at any time, make sure to chime in with questions, please. So here, this is just a really, you know, hypothetical graph where we say, okay, strategy is not static, right? Strategy changes over the life of a business. And if you take you know, I work with a lot of startups, so I see a lot of people who at the very beginning who the only thing they have in terms of IP is an idea. They start out with this grand idea and a lot of passion, and over time, your mix of IP, represented by the different colors in this graph, is going to change. You might become more patent heavy. You might become more trademark heavy. You might, you know, rely a lot on contractual agreements with strategic partners, perhaps, or maybe your business is very much into, you know, trade secrets. It just depends. But that's going to change as you go through the different stages of a business. We're going to skip that slide. So here's how. And this is a terrible graphic because I'm not a graphic artist or a chemical engineer, but the business strategy, what I like to do, and this is actually what I like to do, what I do is take and I look at these 4 factors in the gold here, because I want to know, you know, I don't necessarily need to know your business strategy as defined by your marketing team or even your CEO perhaps, but I want to know your business strategy as it's relevant to your IP development and commercialization. And so the things that I think are very important to that are your business model. You know, how do you make money? Because that's gonna vary a lot of different ways. What's your primary business objective? And this gets back to the question that we had about cost leadership, product differentiation. You know, what is the way that you're doing that? What is your, or at least the objective that you're trying to achieve in terms of your industry? Where do you want to sit? What do you want to be known as? Business growth stage, that's the slide we just looked at. I think it's super important to know what's your business, what stage of growth are you at in your business? If you're a startup or you're a couple founders or you're funded, those are all going to influence the type of IP strategy that we can implement for your assets. And then fourth one, excuse me, is the technology adoption cycle. Where is the technology, or how much has the technology been adopted for, and maybe not your technology, because your technology, right? You're an inventor, your technology is brand new, but the type of technology that you're working in, how much has that been adopted already? I about turned to look at my bookshelves. You've got the, I'm spacing it right now, which is why I was going to turn around, but you've got the different stages of technology adoption. Jeffrey, someone help me with his name, wrote the book on the chasm. What's that one? Anyway, there's a book. It's a great book about a chasm. I'll remember it later. But it's related to when you're rolling out technology. You've got your early adopters, your innovators that adopt the technology initially. You got your early stage majority, your late stage majority, and then your laggards who adopt. And there's a chasm in there. You don't have to use necessarily that adoption cycle, but when you look at where the technology overall, the industry that you're in is, that if it's a well adopted technology, you have probably a very different strategy than if you're an early stage innovative entrant, maybe into a blue ocean market. So those types of things typically come into play to be able to look at and characterize or create a business strategy profile that's relevant to then aligning with our IP strategy, or creating an IP strategy if you don't have one. So did I see a question come in by chance?
Tiffany is wondering, was it innovators imperative?
It might be by the same guy.
Crossing the chasm.
Yes, thank you. You win a prize. Amy, tell them what they won. Just kidding.
You get a free PDF of this presentation. Nice.
So what we do at a really high general level is we take that and we say, what are the, let me see what my next slide is. Well, what is the business strategy profile that we're dealing with? Because we then want to look at a series of different categories of ranking factors. And let me step back real quick. What we're trying to achieve here, again, is align your IP strategy with your business strategy. And in order to do that, we need to understand your business strategy. And then we need to look at the different types of factors that might be relevant to your business strategy that we can use to then characterize, rank, weight, whatever you want to call it, your IP assets, the ones that you're developing. Early stage things like an innovation disclosure should be characterized. Late stage obsolescence, impending type assets should be characterized. And by characterizing them with some type of factors that you can look at over time, you create the ability to dynamically manage your portfolio rather than creating static pictures at different instances. I was at lunch a while ago with a really good friend of mine. He's been in-house 10 years, just switched somewhere else. Big company, a couple of different divisions. I think they sold off the enterprise and kept the personal, or vice versa. Anyway, I said, hey, and he's a smart guy. He does a lot of strategic thinking. I said, what do you do with your strategy? How did you determine when you had this sale of half of your business? And it's a software business, so a lot of the stuff was modular and might apply to both sides of the business. How did you decide what to sell and what not to sell? And he said, well, Jeff, we did, like 3 years ago, we did this huge analysis. It took like all year long to look at all of our portfolio, 10,000 patents or whatever it was. And we kind of did what you're talking about. We rated them and all this stuff. I said, yeah, but what do you do with that today? How did you use that when you're, 3 years later? He said, well, we used it, but we shouldn't have, because it was 3 years outdated. Our business model changed, certain things in our business were different. But that was the best we had. And it was, only 3 years old. So we used it. Weren't his exact words, but something like that. Right. So, which is good. That's better than nothing, but it's really expensive to do this analysis. You might as well do it in a way that it can continue to live with your portfolio as it grows. It can continue to grow and adapt as your business changes. And that's, again, why I started this discussion about a choice framework. I think you really needed to have a framework that you develop that you can adopt and take with you as you go. So.
I'm gonna jump in here. We did get a comment from Megan, and I'm just gonna throw it out here, and then we can both address pieces of it. I think
Sure.
her comment is, can you explain how to get expert help on commercialization around existing IP in my field, medical devices? Should we explore negotiating licensing a similar patent I stumble upon, not currently in use, then further file for a new patent later on? I have patent pending from USPO and will need to prove my claims or amend claims, but it will take time. I'm motivated to keep on commercial trail now. So one thing that I just like to throw out there, this is one of many details that we'll go into greater length on at the Elevate Summit with regard to running your business, commercializing products, and devising growth strategies. So I do want to put a little plug in there because it's relevant. We're an hour today. Elevate Summit this November is going to be all day. So you'll get a lot there. But Jeff, do you want to just throw out some thoughts and comments, and maybe we could take this offline and have a free consult and just explore it a little bit further?
Yeah, I might need to do that only because I don't think I followed the question entirely. It sounds to me like it's a pretty typical situation. We are developing IP while we're trying to figure out if we have a market for this IP, and if we have a market, how are we going to sell it, and how much emphasis and money should we throw into the IP before it's fully developed and commercialized? I don't know. Am I on the right track with the question that was asked?
That's in many ways what it looked like to me.
Okay. Yeah, it might be easier to have a quick conversation with a little more specifics, but it's a very common scenario. And, when you're really early stage and you've got one or two patents, one or two inventions that you're trying to commercialize as a small business, it's relatively easy to say, okay, that's, just make decisions based on this one asset. And I use asset to say patent or patent application. Just use, let's just make individual decisions. And that works really well. It's efficient. What I would say that a lot of people get caught up in, and that's one of the case studies later on, if we have time, is that people, when they invent the product and then they found that they start the company and then they go get funding, it's been sometimes 3 or 4 years or longer of just this kind of churning of all of this information. And then you go and you say, well, who's our customer? You try to sell it. You may have changed the emphasis of your technology several times. The way that you claim your technology might change based on who the target market is. If you want to, protect against somebody manufacturing it, or maybe you need to protect against the end user consumers from infringing it, because that's the most efficient way to stop your competitors from selling to those consumers. So business models are going to change over time with any small startup, or maybe even to the division of a large, kind of an innovative startup division of a larger corporation. And that's why in this slide here, the business model is one of the really important factors in helping us create the framework. So that's not going to help answer that specific question, unfortunately, but I'd be happy, Jason, to jump on it.
Yeah, we'll work with you, Megan, to get something scheduled. But the only thing I would add is, there's always benefit to iterative improvement. So if you have a minimum viable product that is going to put your brand in a good light and service your target market, that can generate cash flow for iterative improvement and planned obsolescence. Iterative improvement and staying fresh within the market will give you the opportunity to stay ahead of your competition. So, one of the things when I was launching my technology product that I always worked with my team on is, at what point is our product good enough to sell, and which of the innovations that we have on our R&D roster are things that will make a great Gen 2, Gen 3, and Gen 4 product to sell back to our original customers, and how do we prioritize those? So to me, there's a big importance of getting some cash flow as quickly as possible without damaging your brand integrity, and strategizing those iterative product releases.
And I will add that I agree 100% with that. A lot of inventors, small startups, they get really, it's super easy, especially for, we engineers, right, Jason? We say, I created something. I am the father of this innovation, and this is awesome. And innovation and, all the freedom to, what I call freedom to operate your business, all the legal, administrative, all that stuff. That's one leg of a three-legged stool. You also have to have technology validation. Make sure you have technology that works, and you have to have market validation. And I think early on, and maybe forever, freedom to operate your business is really only works if you have identified your market and know how to sell into them and know what you're selling that you can make money on. And other than that, there's no reason to have a patent other than an expensive trophy, which I had one guy actually tell me he wanted one time. Sure, you can pay me thousands of dollars to get you a trophy, I guess. I don't know that I would do that myself, but anyway, so it's really, that's just one aspect of it. And the other two have got to be, I think, more important. What is your product? What are you selling? How do you make money at it? Otherwise, you don't need to have a business. So I'm going to just present this one last slide, unless we have questions right now, and I can stay after a few minutes if it's helpful. But I wanted to make sure to get a framework that people can start to think about. And this is pretty rudimentary. There are a lot more sophisticated ways to do this with software and weighting and various inputs from team members and such. But this is a really maybe simple place to start if you're not sure where to start. If you look at the patents you have, the inventions you're working on, maybe and this is more patent specific, but you can create something similar for trademarks, trade secrets. You can start to say, well, what are the technical and commercial issues that we need to think about in our business? What are the legal issues that we need to think about with our patents? What are the kind of the internal factors? How do we run our business? And what are the external factors? What does a competitive market look like? And I've just cross-referenced these to create a couple buckets where you can say, if I rate my patents in these areas, I at least have an understanding of what, and then I, combine those, put whatever weighting you want on them, combine those and come up with a score. I call it an IP score for every asset you've got. And you can at least go into a meeting and say, well, we have, 17 patents and 3 of them are really highly rated. And it might vary as to why. 2 of them are average and the rest of them, we found out, score really, really low because we either can't get a patent or whatever, right? But having that scoring system gives you the ability to at least discuss with some background and some insight as to why things are important, how they align versus how they don't align. So I'm gonna leave it there. I've got more to say, but that's the time we have today. So
yes, we are
thank
at
you.
the hour mark. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, I did drop in a link for our Elevate Summit for Entrepreneurs. Join our wait list. You'll be the first ones to be notified when ticket sales start for that November 19th conference. But Jeff and Jason, thank you so much for being on the panel today. And I know I learned a lot of information that I would have never even thought of before aligning that IP with a strategy. So definitely great information. And I will get you guys in contact with Megan so you can give some more insight and she can clarify what her questions are. But again, thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you
thanks,
so much
Jeff.
for having me.
It was
Yes.
a lot of fun. We'll
All
talk
right.
soon.
Have
All
a
right. Thanks, everyone.
good. Bye.